Hi, I'm Kathy G, and this is my new YouTube channel, History. That's me on the left, but I prefer you focus on the guy on the right. Now, today's topic is all about just how bad an erupting volcano can ruin your day. But before we begin, if you like videos that are all about science and the dance macabre, you've come to the right place, because that's all I do. I upload at least one video per week, and sometimes more, about the scientific analysis of human remains. So if you're into that, and you haven't already done so, please squeeze the like button between your thumb and index finger until it pops. And then please subscribe to my channel and press the notifications button so you'll get a notification when I upload a new video. Okay, so let's get to today's topic. What happens when a pyroclastic flow hits a human body? Spoiler, it's not good. Our story begins on a fateful August day in 79 CE. CE is the new AD, in case you're wondering. Anyway, on August 24th of that year, an explosion, much like this one you see here, ruined the day of a whole lot of people living in Pompeii, Herculaneum, Bosco Reale, Oplantis, and Stabiae in what is now Italy. The villain in our story is the big mountain you see in the background of Pompeii in this image. Here's a better shot from the Bay of Naples. Mount Vesuvius is the name of our antagonist, and it's what's known as a soma stratovolcano. That means that the Gran Cono, which you can see on the right in this image, is surrounded by the rim of a summit caldera, which you see on the left, and then kind of coming around and surrounding the Gran Cono. The summit caldera was formed when a much taller volcano called Mount Soma collapsed about 17,000 years ago. It has been enlarged by several subsequent eruptions, including the one in 79 CE, which formed the Gran Cono itself. Okay, so here's a Google Earth map showing you the location of the two towns that we're really interested in, Pompeii and Herculaneum, relative to the angry volcano Grump. I mean volcano god, of course. What you see here is that Pompeii is about 8 kilometers or approximately 5 miles to the southeast of the crater of Vesuvius, and Herculaneum is approximately 7 kilometers or about 4 miles due west of the crater. This is going to be important information later on. Now, the ancient city of Pompeii, which you see here, was about 64 to 67 hectares, or approximately 170 acres in size. And population estimates, which are based on household counts, suggest that at least 11,000 people, and perhaps as many as 20,000 people, occupied the city in 79 CE. By the time of the eruption, Pompeii had become a bustling Roman town, and it was also a favorite vacation spot for elite Romans, many of whom had holiday villas in the area. The eruption preserved many, many details of Roman life. And what we see is that thanks to the fertile volcanic soil in the area, the volcano giveth, and it can really taketh away. But the land was very productive, and the rural areas around Pompeii yielded a variety of crops, including wheat, cereal, barley, and millet. Also, wine and olive oil were produced in abundance, making Pompeii a very fun town, but also allowing them to export those products to other areas. Some of the archaeological evidence for the agricultural economy includes things like the remains of bakeries, and even bread loaves were preserved in brick ovens. And there were also lava stone mills that were turned by donkeys. In fact, there were even skeletons of donkeys found in the mills. And so you can see that you get some great preservation with a volcanic eruption. Herculaneum, which you can see here, was a wealthier community than nearby Pompeii. This is demonstrated archaeologically by, among other things, the fact that the streets were very narrow and would have prohibited the passage of carts or wagons. Additionally, there was a high density of fine houses with more lavish decorative elements than what was seen at Pompeii. Now, the main economy of the town was based on fishing, and this is evidenced by the remains of boathouses, as well as a high volume of fishing nets, bronze hooks, sinkers, and fish skeletons. Now, interestingly, when the mountain initially erupted, it affected Pompeii with a rain of ash and pumice, but not Herculaneum. And this fact, combined with the finds of relatively few skeletons in the early excavations, caused researchers to think that maybe most of the inhabitants of Herculaneum had managed to escape. This was sadly not the case, however, as excavations in 1981, led by Dr. Giuseppe Magi, would reveal. His excavations initially turned up more than 55 skeletons on the beach and in a few of the boat chambers along the shore. But since that time, over 300 victims of Herculaneum have been found, most of them inside of the boathouses. Now, there weren't any remains of boats discovered in these chambers, and so it appears that some people did escape by boat, as many did on that fateful day. But the remaining residents of Herculaneum, who were probably waiting to be rescued by boat, had no other choice but to try to save themselves by taking shelter in these boathouses. Unfortunately, these structures offered very little protection from the pyroclastic surges that came rushing at them at over 100 miles per hour. Well, that's over 160 kilometers per hour. And with temperatures that were approximately 500 degrees Celsius or 932 degrees Fahrenheit. That's sizzling hot. The preservation of materials at both of these sites was just spectacular. Here you can see a fresco from the site of Pompeii, and the preservation is just exquisite. This fresco is believed to be showing medical treatments at the site of Herculaneum. And here's a beautiful design on one of the floors of a house. Here's another colorful fresco from Herculaneum. Just look at the beautifully preserved colors on this. And this one too. Even wood was preserved as shown in this structure. And here are the remains of a rope and an anchor. It's incredible how well preserved these materials are, considering that they got covered by red hot magma. But because they got covered over so quickly, that's actually what limited more heat destruction, as we'll see when we discuss what we're really interested in today, the preservation of the human remains. At the site of Pompeii, one of the more incredible finds was of these human victims, some of which look to have been frozen by the heat as they were moving around. But these aren't actually the bodies of the people. You see, when archaeologists were first excavating at the site of Pompeii, they kept finding these vacant spaces or voids in the hardened pyroclastic flow. Excavations actually began at Pompeii in 1749. I know, right? But it wasn't until 1863 that Giuseppe Fiorelli figured out that the voids were actually impressions of human bodies. So he devised a way to fill the voids with plaster, and the results were, well, startling to say the least. Here are some of the pictures of these impressions left in the pyroclastic material. This is one of the most famous finds of void bodies. It's called the Garden of the Fugitives, and several victims of the eruption were found here, all aligned against a wall. That's their original location, too. Here you can see the futile struggle of these hapless victims as their lives ended. Here are a few more pictures of some void bodies. What's interesting, though, is how these bodies compare to the other sites where human remains have been found. Here are a few pictures from the site of Herculaneum, and what you'll notice is that these aren't void bodies. They're just regular skeletons. What's that about? Why didn't they preserve in the same way when they were hit by the same volcanic eruption? Well, you might remember this Google Earth map showing the location of the sites relative to the crater of the erupting volcano. The distance of the sites from the crater and the direction is a big part of why there was such a difference in the preservation at the two sites. Remember, Pompeii is located about a mile further away and to the southeast, whereas Herculaneum is closer and due west of the crater. These two factors affected the heat of the pyroclastic surges that hit each site. But before we go any further, let's talk about the mechanics of a volcanic eruption. When a volcano erupts, you see, it ejects liquid rock, that's hot magma, which cools in the air after it's been ejected. And as it's cooling, it turns into a solid. Well, pretty soon, the ash column shooting out of the mouth of this possessed volcano, kind of a little bit reminiscent of The Exorcist, well, pretty soon it can't support the amount of solid material it's carrying. So it collapses and becomes a pyroclastic surge. Now, lighter particles of ash are still in the air, and when that mixes with rain, Well, you get yourself a thick slurry of cement sludge. It's not pretty. You actually get what's called a lahar, which is pretty much a mud flood, but the mud is sizzling hot. So, when the surge of pyroclastic debris hit these towns around the volcano, of course, the heat affected the materials it came in contact with. But then the material kept on coming, thereby covering the previous deposits and limiting the exposure of the materials, including the bodies, to any further heat destruction. That's how they got preserved. But why the difference is seen in the bodies at Herculaneum as opposed to Pompeii? Why weren't there void bodies created at Herculaneum? Well, before we talk about that, let's talk about why so much was preserved at these sites. A big factor in the preservation at both of these sites was the mountain of material deposited on top of them. Herculaneum was buried under 9 to 21 meters, or 30 to 69 feet if you prefer, of pyroclastic mountain vomit, and Pompeii was buried under some 4 meters, or 13 feet. Now, the second thing that was really important regarding the preservation of the body specifically was the temperature difference of the pyroclastic surges at both sites. The victims at Herculaneum and Oplontis were exposed to higher temperatures, at least 500 degrees Celsius or around 932 degrees Fahrenheit. Talk about sizzling hot. This kind of heat actually makes your skull explode. Boom! And the victims at Herculaneum showed evidence of that. So, with such high heat at Herculaneum and Oplontis, the flesh was immediately seared off the bones and the bone was carbonized, which nicely preserves them. So, if you're ever thinking of getting rid of a body by burning it, remember you're going to be preserving the bones. The carbonization also preserves all sorts of other materials like wooden structures. At Pompeii, the victims and other materials were exposed to heat at lower temperatures for a longer period of time. The heat was around 250 to 300 degrees Celsius, or about 482 to 572 degrees Fahrenheit. To make matters worse, they were also exposed to rains of lapilli. Yeah, that sounds ominous, and it should. These are small beads, kind of like BBs, of volcanic ash. Now, the prevailing winds that day happened to keep those away from Herculaneum. So that all means that there are less well-preserved organic materials at Pompeii, but for the bodies, well, that's another story. You see, at Pompeii, the bodies were initially exposed to lower temperatures, and that burned away some of the soft tissue. But unlike at Herculaneum, it didn't completely vaporize the bodies. So some flesh was burned away, but then the body was very rapidly encased in fine volcanic ash, which later hardened into a porous shell. Since that shell was porous, the soft tissue that was left inside of it decayed over time because bacterial organisms could enter in through the pores. And that left only bones and those void bodies. So to recap, at Herculaneum, hotter temperatures vaporize the soft tissue, but preserve the bones better, while at Pompeii, lower temperatures over a longer period of time, relatively speaking, meant the body was not vaporized, but it was rapidly encased in fine volcanic ash that hardened into a porous shell. The porous nature of the shell allowed for the eventual decay of the soft tissue, which then leached, yuck, out of the shell, leaving only the mold of the body and a few bones. Wow, that's some recap. But what did these hapless victims actually die from? Now, you might think that there's a very obvious answer to that question, given that these poor people were hit by red hot magma. But we want to get really technical here. In particular, we want to understand why some of these people still appeared to be moving when they were frozen by the heat. Initially, people assumed that the victims of the eruption had died of asphyxiation, a lack of oxygen due to being covered in red hot magma. But that doesn't explain the appearance that they were moving when they died. Researchers at first believed that was them simply struggling for breath. but not so fast, because some other very clever researchers led by Giuseppe Mastro Lorenzo were actually able to disprove that idea. They discovered in 2010 that the victims of this eruption died from dun, 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 thermal shock. I'll say they did, but what is that? Thermal shock happens when you're exposed to extreme heat that results in instantaneous death. It results in those very lifelike stances that are seen in a full 73% of the casts at Pompeii. Only 27% showed a quote unquote sleep like stance, but they didn't die in their sleep. So these victims were actually frozen in the heat. Really, they were frozen in their lifelike stances, and that was caused by limb contraction or hyperflexion of the hands and feet, and what's called the pugilistic attitude. Limb contraction and hyperflexion of the hands and feet is seen in a full 76% of the casts that have lifelike stances, and another 64% demonstrate what is called the pugilistic attitude. And what that is really is when the entire arm or leg is flexed because the tissues are dehydrated rapidly and then the tendons and muscles are shortened. It makes your arms go into a kind of a I'm going to scare you pose with your fingers curled and your elbows flexed and your hands are up by your face. When you have this many victims showing these characteristics, the limb contraction and the pugilistic attitude, that indicates something called a cadaveric spasm. You heard me right, cadaveric spasm. Sounds like some kind of zombie dance, doesn't it? Well, in fact, it kind of is. A cadaveric spasm is the instantaneous muscular stiffening that happens in an instant violent death. It effectively crystallizes the last activity of the person immediately prior to their death. It also causes an instant onset of rigor mortis, which is normally seen some 4 to 12 hours after death. But in this case, it happens instantaneously. And rigor mortis is what prevents the muscles from relaxing after someone dies. Now, cadaveric spasm usually only involves certain groups of muscles, but in some cases, it can involve the entire body. This has actually been seen in some battle situations where bodies are exposed to extreme heat, such as that caused by a bomb or something like Agent Orange or Dr. Evil or some other kind of nasty stuff. Given that this many people showed evidence of cadaveric spasm at Pompeii, that points to their instant death due to thermal shock. In fact, those persistent researchers were actually able to prove this by heating bones from recently deceased humans who had donated their bodies to science. Thank you very much, recently deceased humans, and horses who I really hope died from natural causes. Anyway, the researchers heated those bodies to the temperatures that are normal for a pyroclastic surge, somewhere between 100 and 800 degrees Celsius or 212 to 1472 degrees Fahrenheit. And they observed the same exact color changes to the bone and the same exact structural failures as those seen on the victims in Pompeii and Herculaneum. So that all adds up to a pretty sucky day for the Pompeianites, and the Herculaneumites. I'm not sure if that's correct, but I kind of like it. Basically, that magma vomiting volcano can really ruin a good day in the bakery. But I guess on the plus side, you get to be the subject of numerous scientific studies throughout time, so your legacy lives on? Sort of. It's worth noting that the volcano is still active today, and there's equipment monitoring it 24/7. There's also a whole lot more people living in its shadow. That's going to do it for today. If you're interested to learn more, please check the description. I've put links to my books in the Archaeology and the Dead series, and I've also put a link to my UDEMY course on how to analyze a skeleton. If you haven't done so already, please pinch the like button between your thumb and index finger until it pops, and subscribe to my channel. Thanks, and I'll see you soon.